No. Eric is, but I do like I'm doing the community talk. I just corner me. Yeah. Mike Carter told me yesterday that Eli's going to be coming back and coaching the town. Oh, that's exciting to me.
Good morning.
He's excited. Good morning. Class in church.
Oh,
Smith.
well prepared.
We're going to do a little bit of a different thing this morning. Lainey was surprised that I chose the topic for for today. We're going to look at Revelation chapters 2 and 3. I'm going to leave it for you to read this afternoon on your time. But we're going to talk about the letters to the 7 churches of Asia. Absolutely unique part of Scripture, because here is the only place where Jesus speaks directly to congregations of the church. Other places, any other place where the churches are addressed, it's addressed as the church as a whole, and it's addressed through the apostles or through the inspired writers that God sent. But here, Jesus actually speaks directly to these 7 congregations. And interestingly enough, out of the 7, 5 of them, he has pretty harsh things to say. They really were messing up. 2 of the congregations, and that would be Smyrna and Philadelphia, he has absolutely nothing negative to say to those 2 congregations. They were the congregations who were getting it right, and they were, at Smyrna particularly, they were suffering for it, for doing things right. The 7 churches are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Only Ephesus and Laodicea are mentioned in other places in the New Testament. Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, and Philadelphia. This is the only place that you ever hear anything about those churches, or about any connection with the Apostle Paul or any of the other disciples. Let me just tell you a little bit about the 7 cities, because we're going to talk about what's going on in the churches a little bit later. Ephesus was the largest of all of these cities. Sardis or Philadelphia probably were the smallest population-wise. Ephesus had a population at this time of about 250,000 are the estimates. It was noted as a center for this whole region of the world. The Romans set up Ephesus as the place in what is today Turkey that they would deal with. They would go through Ephesus to get to any place in all of present-day Turkey or the rest of Asia at the time. It was a large seaport until the river there dumped so much mud and silt into the harbor that it silted up the whole harbor and prevented them from using it as a port city any longer. It was the place where the Temple of Diana, or the Temple of Artemis was her other name, was, and it was a world famous temple. It was the site of the world's largest amphitheater. Now, I want you to understand what I mean by the world's largest in that time. 50,000 people this amphitheater would seat. Now, that's amazing, because We're talking about in the day when the human voice or a trumpet was the only way to communicate at the time. Can you imagine being in an amphitheater with 50,000 people and no PA system? They made it work. Obviously they made it work, or that it wouldn't have been there. And that amphitheater comes in to play in two passages in the New Testament. Because in Acts 19, when it tells about how Paul went there and preached at Ephesus for a little over 2 years, and then when he left because of conflicts that were going on, there were at Ephesus, the silversmiths rioted because of the growth of the Christian faith there. Because of all of the conversions that were going on, the silversmiths rioted because they were losing their business. The reason they were losing their business is because what they sold was images of Artemis or Diana, as she was variously called. And that's how they made their living. And then all of a sudden people are being converted to Christ. They don't want those idols or images to be worshipped. And so the Demetrius, the silversmith, led a riot of the silversmiths because he was saying, we're going to lose our livelihood. And Paul wanted to go into the theater there because they had taken 2 of our brethren that they had captured. They'd taken them into the theater, and it was obvious what they were planning. They were planning the same kind of things that would happen in the Colosseum in Rome with people of faith. And Paul was saying, I'm going to go, but the brethren said, no, you won't. Because it's not going to do any good for you to go. We're going to leave it with this, and Paul left Ephesus as a result. Those 2 brethren were taken into there, and they were about to be killed when a man named Alexander stood up and told them, you're going to cause the Roman troops to come in here if you do this. And he said, we have the courts, take them to court. And they listened and they settled it down. The other, that's all in Acts 19. The other scriptural reference to Ephesus and to the theater is in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32, where Paul says, if it were not for the resurrection of Christ being true, he says, I would not have fought the wild beasts in Ephesus. That would have been in that theater. This was not during the riot. This was at another time. This was one of the sufferings that Paul went through in his life. And it happened right here in the theater at Ephesus. That's a horrible picture there. Because when he says he fought wild beasts there, we're talking about animals like crocodiles, lions, tigers, bears. That's the kind of animals that they brought into their theater there at Ephesus, or the Colosseum in Rome, or other locations when they were bringing people of faith in there to test them. Testing usually, almost always, ended up in the death of the Christians. Smyrna was a bit smaller. Population is estimated at that time to have been about 160,000. We really don't know much about Smyrna, except for it was noted for the production of myrrh. You remember that myrrh was one of the gifts that the wise men brought at the birth of Jesus. And one thing that we do know about Smyrna is that Smyrna had a high population of Christians. It's estimated that 1/3 of the 160,000 people who lived there were Christians at the time of John's delivering the letter from Jesus. Pergamum had a population estimated to be about 200,000. And one of the things that we know from Jesus' letter to the church at Pergamum is he refers to Pergamum as being the place where Satan's throne is. Pretty strong statement. What that's referring to is that this was the first city outside of Rome where emperor worship was instituted. And there were temples built at Pergamum to Caesar. And so the problem that brought was that if you failed to worship at the emperor's temple or pay the tribute to the temple of the emperor, you were subjected to imprisonment or death. That was just a standard practice. You had to give worship to the emperor if you were in Pergamum. And so that set up the church at Pergamum for extra persecution. Another thing that we know about from the letter is that the Christians at Pergamum, one of the problems that they had was a problem that was mentioned also in the letter to the church at Ephesus, that they had to deal with the teachings of the Nicolaitans. But at Pergamum, as opposed to Ephesus, at Ephesus it says the Christians opposed the teachings of the Nicolaitans. At Pergamum, it says that they were following. The Nicolaitans refer to a group of Christians who were following the teachings of a man named Nicholas. It's generally thought this Nicholas is one of the 7 deacons that were appointed at the church in Jerusalem in the book of Acts. There was one man named Nicholas, and they are pretty sure that he was the one who started this doctrine. Nicholas was a very, very spiritual person. And he thought that anything that distracted him from serving God or from serving Christ was something that he had to do away with. He took it to extremes. He believed that his wife was a distraction from serving God. And he began to teach that a wife was to be a shared thing among the Christians. That a wife didn't belong to one man, she belonged to everybody. And you can see where that goes from there. And so the Nicolaitans, they were teaching basically free sex. And this was in amongst the church, particularly amongst the church at Pergamum. At Ephesus, Jesus says, you opposed that. And that was one of the good things about them. But at Pergamum, they got caught up in it. Thyatira had a population much smaller, estimated to be between 12 and 20,000. So it was what they would have considered a small town. It was famous for its textiles, and particularly famous for its purple dye. And so the purple cloth from Thyatira was famous all over the known world at the time. Now, Thyatira is actually mentioned in one verse in Acts chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. Paul is at Philippi in Greece, and he goes down to the river. There is a woman there named Lydia. The Bible says she was from Thyatira and a seller of purple. So she's involved in this production of the textiles that were so famous. And she was transporting it and marketing it in Greece at the time. She hears Paul preach, and she is converted, but it never tells us that she ever goes back to Thyatira, because at this time her house is at Philippi there. Something interesting about Thyatira is that of all of these 7 cities, it's the only one where the Christian community survives for very long. I found it very interesting that there was a Christian community at Thyatira until 1922. And in 1922, the Muslim government of Turkey exiled all of the Christians from Thyatira. Most of them ended up in London, but there was a Christian community at Thyatira until 1922. Sardis was, we have no idea how many people lived there, but it was the capital of the province of Lydia. It was noted because it was a wealthy place, primarily because of the gold that was found in the river nearby. Interestingly enough, the gold at Sardis, it resulted in the legend of King Croesus. Do y'all remember the legend of Croesus?
Like the Mayas?
Yeah. Everything he touched turned to gold, is what the legend says. That's why, because they produced gold there, a lot of gold there. Sardis was destroyed, completely, absolutely destroyed in AD 17 by a tremendous earthquake that hit that region. It was completely wiped out. And the Sardis that the church became established in, that would have been probably somewhere around between 40 and 70 AD, when the church was established there, the only reason there was a Sardis there was because the Roman government forgave all of the taxes from that area to get the city rebuilt because of the gold. And then Philadelphia. All we know about it was that it was also totally destroyed in AD 17 by that earthquake. And it was also rebuilt by the Emperor Tiberius because it was on what became the major trade route from the coast of Asia Minor all the way to Asia Major, all the way to China and India. Laodicea is mentioned in Colossians, in the letter that Paul wrote to Colossians. Evidently, Paul had started the church at Laodicea during his time when he was in the region of Ephesus. Paul, when he wrote the letter to the Colossians in chapter 4, verse 16, he says, the letter that you're reading, read it to the church at Laodicea. And then very mysteriously he says, and the letter that I've sent to Laodicea, you read. We have no idea what happened to the letter to the Laodicean church, but we know it was a real thing. Now that I've introduced you to the churches, I want to introduce you to our subject. The letters to the 7 churches of Asia are written by Jesus Christ and delivered through John for one purpose. He wants them to know how to do church right. So what we're going to be talking about is doing church right. Yes, sir?
You know, I'm wondering, think about the sizes of these places and the number of people that are there. Did they have multiple congregations in the church, or was it just one congregation? It seems as though there was just one group. He's addressing them as a church, as a group. So it makes you wonder if there was always just was one congregation in a place, or multiple. Are there other places in the Bible that we see any indication that it's anything other than one congregation in a town, a community, whatever?
My thought is, and a lot of people think this too, is that there was no whole meeting of the church. They were house churches, but they considered themselves one church. And they were, and they, you go back to the record of the church at Jerusalem. Started out with 3,000, quickly became 5,000. And then the next thing that it says about the church at Jerusalem in the book of Acts is the number multiplied. So I read somewhere one time that the estimate was about 30,000 at one time that were members of the church in Jerusalem. When you get to Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas go from Antioch down to Jerusalem to talk to the church about the acceptance of the Gentiles into the church, whether they need to be circumcised. And it says that they went to the elders of the church at Jerusalem. Number one, one, they couldn't have met all at one place because they were under persecution already. And that's probably the way it worked in these cities. It probably, I mean, they were one church and they felt that they were one church, but they were not meeting together.
You know, you see in different congregations, even today, so much different practices may be accepted or not accepted, and you know, so here they're being generalized by Jesus that all the different groups, did they all support this Nicolaitans thing or not, or what? And
actually, in the letter to Pergamum, he says not all have accepted this. Also in the letter to Thyatira, he says there's some of y'all that aren't accepting or following the Jezebel.
What's a little surprising too is that he addresses them as a church, and you think some of these practices that were going on, he would have thought, that can't be a part of me, that's not even the church. But yet he's still called to the church.
Yeah.
Even though they had all these things going on. And not only that, he addressed it to the angel. They all had an angel.
Yeah.
So they had an angel and they had a church and all these things going on.
Absolutely. That's important stuff. Let's look at what Jesus says they were doing when they were doing church right. I've got the list there on your sheet, and the numbers out beside each line is the verse where he says this. Here's what the churches were doing right. In chapter 2, verse 2, he says, you don't tolerate evil people. That's important, isn't it? That the church doesn't tolerate evil people, but I want you to understand something here. There's a difference. What's the difference between evil people and sinners? Because he's not going to tell them don't accept sinners. There's good reason why he's not going to tell them not to accept sinners, because everybody in the church are sinners, right? Still today. But what's the difference between sinners and evil people?
It's like the difference between somebody who gets drunk and drunkenness.
Yes, exactly. What we have here, the evil people are the ones who are involved in this, and they ain't going to change. They are in it on purpose. And sometimes evil people do get into the church. And the church can't tolerate evil people. What it can do with evil people is the church do its best to change them and make them not evil people. The second one is, he says, you test those who claim spiritual leadership. He says, and what he actually says is, you have those that claim to be apostles, and you test them to see whether they really are or not. Don't accept that somebody says, I am this. How do you test them? Yes, you remember in the book of Acts it says these were the Bereans were more noble than those at Thessalonica. Why? Because they checked daily to see whether those things that they were being told were so.
But it also says that you test to make sure they're not liars. The way we test people today is that you put them through an exam, you ask them questions, you do a practice. You've got to see their deeds and see their responses and ask them questions to get to know them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The third one in chapter 2, verse 4, he's telling them, you left your first love. That's the problem that they had. Okay, so what's the strong point there? You go back to your first love. Who's their first love?
Jesus.
Jesus. You go back to loving Jesus and not loving anything else above Jesus. And then chapter 2, verse 10, he tells them, don't be afraid. Why did these people in these churches have reason to be afraid?
Says some of them are about to be thrown into prison and be tested, have tribulation.
And some of them are going to be taken into the theater and have to fight wild beasts, right? Or they're going to witness that at the least. And sometimes they witness that with their loved ones being the target. And then in chapter 2, verse 10, how do you do church right? He says, be faithful until death. This isn't something that you do for a little time. This isn't something you do for a while. This isn't something you do for a long time. This is something you do as long as you live. Be faithful until death. And then chapter 2, verse 13, he tells them, don't deny the faith. Another thing that the Nicolaitans did, that they taught, that really was causing people to be lost, was they said that in the face of persecution, to avoid death, it was all right for you to say, I'm not a follower of Christ. And Jesus says, what you're doing that's right is you're not denying the faith. You're going to stand up for the faith in the face of anything, even death. And then in chapter 2, verse 19, he tells the church that they are to serve, and don't you like this next word, and persevere. Serve, who are they to serve? Number one, serve God, which means serve Christ. But if you read all of the New Testament, you see over and over again they're told to serve one another. And what does the word persevere mean? Basically, it means be faithful until death. Persevere means you keep on, you don't stop, you never stop. You never let up. And then in chapter 2, verse 20, he gets to something that's really hard. He talks about, to two different churches, he talks about them becoming involved in sexual sin. But in verse 20, he's specifically talking about leaders in the church being involved in sexual sin. And so what Jesus is saying to the churches here is don't tolerate sexual sin by your leaders. That's a strong message even for today, isn't it? Well, all of this is a strong message for even for today. But this is especially something that over the last 20 years has become relevant in our society, with church leaders being caught up in scandals, caught up in sexual sin. And this is something that destroys the church. Obviously, it destroys the church. And then in 2 verse 25, he just says, hold firmly until I come back. Don't let up. Just be firm in your faith, firm in your life as a Christian. And then in chapter 3, verse 3, he says, remember what you have received. What is it that you have received?
Gospel.
The gospel, the word of faith. And then he says, and keep it. Remember it and keep it. Chapter 3, verse 12, he says, overcome. At least 2 different churches, he tells them, overcome. Overcome what? Overcome the world. Overcome all opposition. And then in chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, you see I've got be hot. I find that easy, even in the winter, to be hot. That's not what he's talking about. Being hot here is being zealous, being energetic in the service, being energetic in doing what the church needs to be doing. And then in verses 17 and 18 of chapter 3, he says one of the churches, one of their problems was that they said, we're rich because of what we do. And the point is, in everything give credit to God. And then in verse 19 of chapter 3, he tells them, accept God's discipline. This is how you do church right. You accept the discipline that comes from God. And then in chapter 3, verse 20, he talks about an open door. He talks about an open door to 2 different churches. To Philadelphia, he says, I have opened a door that no man can shut. And he doesn't even say go through the door, but that's what the implication is. I've opened the door, you go. And then to Laodicea, he says, I stand at the door and knock. What's he saying? Open the door. Jesus stands at the door. He's not opening that door. He's expecting us to open the door. Okay, this is generally, we're going through this very fast because I wanted to cover all of this. These are the things that Jesus says they should be doing if they're going to do church right. Then also in these chapters, he gives the rewards for doing church right. We're going to go through it pretty quickly. Chapter 2, verse 7, he says, you will eat of the tree of life. Refers all the way back to Genesis, the first 3 chapters of Genesis. In the Garden of Eden, there was a tree of life. God took it away because of disobedience. He says that tree of life is still there. And if you do church right, you're going to get to eat of the tree of life. What does that mean? That means eternal life. And then 2 verse 10, he says, if you do these things, you will receive the crown of life. Again, about life eternal. And then in chapter 2, verse 11, he tells one of the churches, you will not be hurt by the second death. Okay, he's promised life twice. Now he says, you won't be hurt by the second death. What is the second death? It's what happens after physical death. If you are away from Christ and not in the family of God. And then in chapter 2, verse 17, he says, I will give you the hidden manna. What's this talking about? What's the hidden manna? You remember Jesus says, I am the bread of life. The hidden manna is Jesus, because Jesus is the bread of life. And then in chapter 2, verse 17, he says, your new name will be written on a white stone. You will receive a new name, and it will be written on the white stone. What's the new name? He will be given a name which is above all names. We will be given the name that is given to Christ if we do church right. And then the one that I have no idea what it means. In chapter 2, verse 26, he says, I will give you authority over the nations. I don't know what that means. Maybe you do. But what I do know is he says, if you do church right, I will give you authority over the nations. And then in chapter 2, verse 28, he says, I will give you the morning star. That's beautiful poetic language. The morning star has to be Jesus. In chapter 3, verse 4, he says, you will walk with me in white. I can't think of anything better than to walk with Jesus. And then in chapter 3, verse 5, he says this, I will confess your name before my Father. What's that mean? It means he's going to stand before God and say, this one belongs to me. And then in chapter 3, verse 10, he says, I will keep you from the hour of testing. Not everybody's going to escape the testing, because there were, in the days, in these churches, there were people who were going to be persecuted, even killed for their faith. But that particular church, he says, I'll keep you from the hour of testing. Chapter 3, verse 12, he says, I will make you a pillar in the temple of God. Chapter 3, verse 12, he also says, I will write on you the name of my God. Chapter 3, verse 20, he says, I will dine with you. Chapter 3, verse 21 says, you will sit with me on my throne. Pretty good rewards. But he says that's what you will get for doing church right. Now, I want you to notice, he doesn't make these promises to the church. He makes these promises to the people who make up the church, to the individuals. That's how important we are. Jesus looks to the church. He calls it his bride. But he looks to us inside the church. He holds us responsible for doing church right. But he also rewards us doing church right. I know we went pretty fast, but I wanted to cover this. I want you to go back and today and during the next week, read those two chapters read those 7 letters.